On November the 3rd, Americans will head to the polls and send either Joe Biden or Donald Trump to the White House. President Trump turned American foreign policy inside out to the benefit of some nations and dismay of others. Now, both groups are watching attentively to see which direction the U.S. goes next. So what does the upcoming election mean for the world? And lately, I've been talking to Martin Jacques, former senior fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies with Cambridge University. He's also the author of the book, When China Rules the World. Let's listen to his take about the upcoming U.S. election and its overall impact. So many things are changing so fast every day, but the biggest drama, of course, U.S. presidential election. Do you think Europe as a whole, even though very hard to generalize like that, have any preference between the two candidates?
Well, I think it varies across Europe. I mean, I think the key countries of Western Europe, by and large, are of a like mind, notably Germany and France. They would like to see a Biden victory, and they would like to see the back of Trump. And I think that's probably a view shared widely across the European Union. There are, of course, countries in Eastern Europe, like Hungary, that prefer Trump. And the UK government certainly, although it's not making a song and dance about this at the moment, would prefer Trump.
Very interesting. If I could read some of the latest surveys coming from ECFR, which stands for European Council on Foreign Relations, they had a survey recently that found in a continent-wide survey that even if Joe Biden were elected, it said, voters in France and Germany believe Europe should, quote, maintain good relations with the U.S., but prepare for disengagement. Should Trump win, however, voters in Belgium, Sweden, Austria, and Croatia all believe preparation for disengagement would be necessary. End of quote. Of course, a survey is one thing, eventual strategic choice is another thing, but it's an interesting result.
I think it is a very interesting result, and I don't think it's a surprising result.
Why not?
Because, well, there's a much longer-term picture, and there's the relatively short-term picture. The relatively long-term picture, which has really since, let's say, even before the Iraq War, but from the Iraq War onwards, Europeans have felt less and less good, less and less comfortable about the United States. It's been moving, in their view, in a different direction to the one that Europe's been moving. In the shorter-term perspective, which is really dates from 2016 and the election of Trump as president, then I think most Europeans cannot identify with Trump, don't support him, and find him unacceptable. And this is, I think this is very common across a lot of people within the European Union. And as a result of that, I think strategically now there's a widespread view in Europe that the relationship in the future with the United States will take a different course to what's happened in the past. I mean, really, the great solidification of the U.S.-Europe relationship was in the context of the Cold War. And ever since the Cold War, that relationship has in varying ways been weakening. But really, with the Trump administration, this is something different, because Trump clearly has rejected the idea of the multilateral relationship and the so-called Western order and so on since 1945, and rejected, in a sense, Europe in the process, including the European Union.
If you look at the agenda between the United States and Europe, the cross-Atlantic agenda, one would look at the immediate ones, such as the pandemic, and then the longer-term ones, such as climate change, which Europe as a continent have been quite enthusiastic about. There's, of course, also the international and multilateral mechanism. Both Europe and also U.S. Should play a significant role there. How much common ground do you identify on some of these areas?
Well, on one issue, of course, they are absolutely in opposite positions, which is climate change. I mean, this is over a long period. I mean, go back to George W. Bush and so on. I mean, you know, he rejected the idea of climate change, and this has been a long-running thread in American policy, particularly as far as the Republicans are concerned. And Trump absolutely rejects the idea of climate change. You know, he makes fun of it. He thinks it's a joke, and he has poured, you know, lots of taxpayers' money into the oil and gas lobby in the United States. And I think this is very important to understand this, that this is part also of a wider problem. It's not just the climate change, but there is very powerful body of opinion, which of course is essentially part of the Trump bloc, which is sort of anti-science. You know, there's an irrationality about it. And this is a very important thread, which is not discussed enough, actually. In American society, there is a kind of anti-enlightenment block of opinion. You can't understand the emergence of Trump, you can't understand the support for Trump without recognizing this. And it is a very powerful steer on what happens in America, as we can see.
How that also transforms the interesting way of handling the pandemic also in the U.S. And as a result, where is Europe, where is the U.S. on the controlling and prevention of COVID-19? We see apparent differences. How do you see these choices, approaches? How will that, in a way, help the two sides to outline the future they could have, and therefore have an impact on Europeans' perspective about this election?
Well, of course, the pandemic, Trump's handling of the pandemic is an important illustration of the point I was just making, which is that, you know, he rejects the idea of I mean, his position is in many on the pandemic is in many ways sort of fantasy land. You know, he doesn't accept the science. He talks rubbish about the nature of the virus and how to deal with the virus, and it doesn't exist anymore, and this drug works and it doesn't work, and all this kind of thing. You know, we've seen all of this. But I think that on the actual handling of the pandemic, you know, basically, I'm simplifying here, you've seen three approaches to the pandemic, globally speaking. First of all, you've had China and what I'll call the Confucian societies like South Korea, Japan, and so on. And their attitude towards the pandemic is to eliminate the pandemic. You don't learn to live with it, you eliminate it. No tolerance, zero tolerance. And they've been very successful along that path. China's been brilliantly successful, but so South Korea and so on. So that's the first position. The second position is essentially the American position, which is what matters is not the virus, not the pandemic. What matters is the economy. What matters is not social discipline and collective responses, but individualism. Do what you like, individual liberties. And the European response is somewhere between the two. Generally in Europe, what's happened is that, you know, there's no strategy, really. They don't know how to handle it. So as a result, they blow hot, they blow cold. They go down to lockdown, they ease the lockdown. So it comes and it goes. And at the moment in Europe, we're having a big second wave now. So we're going back to where we were in the period March, April, May, essentially. So this is a different approach to the United States, but it's not like the Chinese or the South Korean approach. So in effect, Europe has certain commonality with America in that we are in practice learning to live with it and praying one day there'll be a vaccine. But it's not the same as the American position. The American position is the outlier because the American position under Trump, anyway, is, you know, let's move on. Life is normal. So what? It's a pandemic. 220,000 people have died. Well, so what? It doesn't matter.
So will that change with the new administration coming in? Will a new president and his a team be able to repair some of the earlier weak links regarding, for example, public health and the pandemic?
Well, I think on the question of the pandemic, a Biden presidency would take a different position. I mean, it would take the virus seriously, and it would take the need to introduce measures, of course, social distancing and wearing masks and so on, and emphasis on public health and so on, it would take a much more serious position than Trump has done as the president. Mm-hmm. So I think that we would see a really a significant difference, and you can see that anyway. I mean, you know, from state to state, because the states matter in the United States. Some states, like California and so on, have taken a very different position. New York took a very different position, for example. It was, you know, whereas in the Midwest and the South, they were, by and large, often closer to Trump's position. So I think we'd see, you know, a significant change of atmosphere on the question of the pandemic. More generally, I think that America is in a new place. It's very divided. It's become increasingly polarized. Therefore, governance has become ineffectual. Race and great historic problems have once again risen to absolutely the mainstream political agenda. And I think that America is a very, very troubled country. And I don't see the election resolving that question. I mean, America is now more divided than probably, well, certainly in my view, since the 1890s. That's a long time.
Interesting.
You know, that's over a century.
Given that division you just mentioned, how much hope do you think the Europeans as a whole, once again, this is very much a generalization, have about be able to work with the U.S., whoever coming into the White House this time, on multilateral platforms and international governance, such as the UN, such as WHO, such as WTO, regarding trade, public health, and many other issues? How fast will a new president adjust?
In some areas, like the pandemic, like the WHO, I would expect a Biden presidency to want to involve itself in a multilateral way on the handling of this. So I think America would become a full-hearted member of the WHO and wouldn't play the kind of game that Trump has played. On trade questions and so on, that I think, to use an English phrase, Biden's going to ship some Trump water on this. I mean, classically, the Democrats have been more protectionist than the Republicans, and the shift on, the hostile shift on trade towards China, I think it's been essentially bipartisan. So I think on those kind of issues, Biden won't be so different from China from Trump. Maybe less abrasive, maybe a little bit more conciliatory in some respects, but on the substance of questions, not so different.
Mr. Jacques, earlier the concept was, or the logic was, oh, let's do business with China, but let's seek security from America. Is that still going to be the logic leading up to the election, and also even after that, whoever in the White House?
Well, I think that Europe is in a different position on China to the United States. And the reason for that is that the American angst about China is driven now primarily by its desire to stop China becoming, the new number one or the hegemonic rival to the United States. Now, Europe does not have that concern in the same way, because Europe has no longer any pretense or aspiration to regard itself as a hegemonic bloc or a hegemonic power. So I think that Europe and the United States are coming from significantly different directions on China, but there are commonalities between them. And I think one of the overarching commonalities is how to deal with something beyond a point they don't understand properly. And China is such a different place to any a different country, different culture, different history to what they're familiar with in what has been, for so long a Western world. And I think that both of them are, in their different ways, struggling to understand that, and Europe is certainly part of that.
If there has been a lot of assumptions about the policies, whether it's a change of administration inside the U.S., whether there will be a so-called like-minded alliance against China, create a common enemy and be able to work on that as the common ground. Do you see that as a possibility?
Yes, I do. I think that the change on China policy in the United States was not simply a function of Trump. I think that would be an illusion. I think that the question of hostility towards China had been building up before the 2016 presidential election,
right.
And the roots of it were in particularly the Midwest, and a strong working class reaction against the essentially stagnation of living standards that they suffered for several decades. And China, and they could see that, the argument that China was at fault for this or was the cause of this accorded with the fact that when their factories got closed, an American multinational might have moved the work to China or something like that. So there was, so that it was a popular move, and it combined with the fact, of course, in the American establishment, and this is across the board in varying degrees, that they'd got China wrong, that they had underestimated China's capacity to rise, and that rise would be successful, and it would remain, as I've always argued, it would remain very Chinese and distinctive and would not become like a Western society and so on. And suddenly the Americans came round to this point of view at the level of the establishment, and that, fueled this new Cold War mentality that we've seen since 2016. Now, I don't think that a Biden presidency is going to roll that back.
Very interesting, certainly, to have your insights as always. All the best wishes, Martin, and we're looking forward to the results of the U.S. presidential election. Certainly that will have an impact on how the future is likely to be shaped. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Be safe.
Thank you. Great to talk again.